Well, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for coming, and it's really kind of you to come, and it's lovely to see so many people I know. Many of whom I should say now have informed what I'm about to say through their thinking and through conversations, and with one or two of you through reading early drafts of my lecture. So thank you to all of you. As Michael said, the title of this talk is Freedom of Speech, Can You Draw a Line? I fear I may disappoint some of you with the answer, but let's see where we get to. On 2nd of October at King's College London, I gave the first lecture in a series on the theme of free speech and offence. Where do you draw the line? Since then, there have been further discussions and articles, as well as a subsequent lecture in that series given by Professor Arif Ahmed, as Michael says, the Office for Students' new Director of Freedom of Speech and Academic Freedom, which he delivered on 9th October. Today, I will consider the extent to which we can draw a bright line delineating lawful free speech and its cousin, academic freedom, particularly when set against unlawful hate speech and harassment. I will begin by summarising the problem and its engagement with the law, and will endeavour to explore tensions with some of the philosophical underpinnings to free speech. In particular, I will consider the extent to which there may be a conflict between freedom of thought and expression and obligations under the Equality Act regarding some protected characteristics, and indeed between protected characteristics, and the Public Sector Equality Duty, the PSED, as well as with other regulatory considerations. Given its central role as the higher education sector's regulator, I will test some of the viewpoints offered by the OFS. I will conclude by attempting to navigate a course that respects and complies with all obligations, but which looks beyond the law for possible solutions to contested issues. Now, Michael has said some of this, but I will say anyway. For context, I should disclose that as well as having practiced as an equality and human rights litigator in private practice, and then as Director of Legal Policy at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the EHRC, I was Chief Executive of Equality Challenge Unit, which was the UK higher education sector's EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, Policy and Research Agency. And that's important because I want to talk about the Athena Swan and the Race Equality Charters, both of which I was responsible for at the time. But let me start by affirming what I hope is self-evident: the critical importance and centrality of free speech in universities, not only to meet legal and other regulatory obligations. I'm getting feedback. Is anyone else? No. Okay. Not only to meet legal and other regulatory obligations, but because evidently it is the cornerstone of scholarly inquiry and research, and also of our responsibility to educate and enlighten. So any problems or lacuna that I consider do not detract from this. And at Sussex, as Michael said, I have responsibility for advancing free speech as well as EDI and broader cultural issues, and I'm committed to each of them. On occasion where there may be actual or purported conflict between or indeed within these commitments, I seek to reconcile without subsuming one under the other. Many of you will be familiar with Enlightenment ideas that energize concepts of free speech from the 17th century onwards, including as an antidote to tyranny and absolute monarchy. There are very many important theorists, philosophers, and writers who have contributed to the canon, but I will note 4, chosen in part for the distinct rationales which they give. In the 17th century, John Milton raised the importance of free speech as a bulwark against orthodoxy, and 150 years later, James Madison spoke to the importance of the First Amendment to the US Constitution as a tool for accountability. Of course, the utilitarian John Stuart Mill advocated extensively for free speech on grounds of human fallibility and the search for truth. And in chapter 2 of his essay on liberty, published in 1859, he articulated several propositions underpinning its importance, including his harm principle. And I quote, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others," unquote. I'm going to return to this later. Then in the 20th century, against the backdrop of totalitarianism, George Orwell advised that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Overall, these ideas underpinned the expansion of democratic life, including protection for minorities, and the emergence, or perhaps re-emergence, of fake news and echo chambers both challenge and make these ideas as important today. Anecdotally, and at least in the abstract, it seems, to me at least, that most people support these principles. So what is the problem? As reported by the EHRC in their Guide for Universities, in 2017, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights held an inquiry into the state of free speech in UK universities and found that while restriction of freedom of expression was not a widespread issue, there were concerns around increased bureaucracy and potential self-censorship from students on campus as a result of the Prevent Duty guidance. They also flagged intolerant attitudes and violent protest as potential obstacles to free speech, as well as a potential conflict in interpretation and grey areas in some existing laws and guidance. On 15 July 2022, Susan Lapworth, who was then interim chief executive at the OFS, stated, and I quote, "Data shows that more than 99% of events and speaker requests were approved in 2020-2021 and suggests that, in general, universities and colleges remain places where debate and the sharing of ideas can thrive," unquote. However, many have cautioned against complacency, referencing both the need to recognise that minority opinions are precisely those which require protection, and also the wider so-called chilling effect of hotly contested disputes. Subsequently, in their insight brief entitled Freedom to Question, Challenge and Debate, published in December last year, the OFS summarised a range of evidence which indicated that restrictions on lawful speech were of significant concern. Interestingly, the most recent National Student Survey asked a new question on freedom of speech, and 86% of respondents indicated that they felt free or very free to express themselves on campus, which of course means that 14% didn't. In a wonky piece published just 2 days ago, see how up to date I am? Analysis of the data concluded that, quote, "Evidence has suggested that those with the characteristics that EDI initiatives tend to be aimed at are those who score lowest on the question," which I hadn't appreciated. So, arguably, the more marginalised you feel, the greater your sense of lack of an ability to speak freely. Meanwhile, in the recent period, there has been a proliferation of activist organisations and journalistic and political commentary making claims and counterclaims about free speech problems. Some, though by no means all, of which, it must be said, appear to be driven by ulterior motives. There have also been many academic contributions. Again, on Monday, the Council for the Defence of British Universities published their position paper on academic freedom. And in his erudite speech at King's on 9th October, which I mentioned earlier, Professor Ahmed noted that, I quote, "Freedom of speech and academic freedom are fundamental to higher education. The core mission of universities and colleges is the pursuit of knowledge, and the principles of free speech and academic freedom are fundamental to this purpose," unquote. And with a degree of prescience borne out by the above-stated wonky article, he also articulated the value of freedom of speech for marginalised people, and I entirely agree. There have, of course, been a number of well-publicised cases and contested areas, including, of course, here at Sussex 2 years ago, concerning opposition to the gender-critical views of one of our professors, Kathleen Stock. Very recently, I read of Alka Segal Cuthbert, director of Don't Divide Us, who was uninvited from the Rethinking Education conference. Indeed, the awful events in Israel and Gaza have themselves given rise to voluminous commentary and debate about free speech, including in respect of the boundary with unlawful harassment and hate speech. Beyond this, concerns have been raised regarding purported indoctrination or expectations in relation to definitions of racism and of equality initiatives, which allegedly restrict free speech. In the UK, concerns about restrictions on free speech are often characterised as being a problem of the left, or of those invested in unearthing and addressing social injustices directly linked to identity, sometimes disparagingly referred to as woke. It bears noting, though, that this issue isn't necessarily or always rooted in progressive ideology. On 21st April this year, the Times newspaper reported that, quote, a survey by the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals found that people were using threatening behaviour to insist that books on empire, race and LGBTQ themes be removed. A third of librarians said that they had been asked to remove works from collections and had even been threatened, unquote. And on 31st January, the Times again reported that, quote, libraries across the United States have denounced an unprecedented surge of book bans as conservatives step up their campaign to outlaw titles beyond sexuality, gender and race, unquote. Apparently these books, which are being banned or removed from libraries, include Toni Morrison's beloved and Harper Lee's classic novel, To Kill a Mockingbird. PEN America recently released its latest book ban report, noting a one-third increase to 3,362 bans in the 2022-23 school year. And meanwhile, Florida Governor and Republican primary presidential candidate Ron DeSantis recently enacted the Stop Woke Act in Florida, which purportedly bans the teaching of various propositions, including critical race theory. And I will return to Mr. DeSantis later. I turn now to legislation. There is, of course, a detailed legislative framework governing free speech, underpinned by Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, incorporated into UK law through the Human Rights Act. Incidentally, it's worth noting, it's often forgotten actually, but it's worth noting that this includes a right to receive and impart ideas, which when you consider alongside Article 14 of the ECHR, which is the prohibition of discrimination in relation to other rights and freedoms, arguably invites consideration of how universities can ensure that different groups, including in particular minoritized groups, can impart their ideas and have them received. Article 10.2 sets out those circumstances when this freedom may be restricted, which in summary includes harassment, threats of violence and criminality, defamation and breaches of intellectual property, employment obligations, privacy rights, the prevent duties and anti-terrorism, regulation of communications and obligations of charities, including universities, under charity law. Also, Article 17, which is sometimes called the Abuse Clause, prohibits engagement in any activity or the performance of any act aimed at the destruction of any of the other rights and freedoms under the ECHR. For universities, Section 43 of the Education No. 2 Act 1986 requires that they take such steps as are reasonably practicable to ensure that freedom of speech within the law is secured for members, students and employees of the establishment and for visiting speakers. And governing bodies must maintain a code of practice. Section 202 of the Education Reform Act 1988 requires universities to have regard to the need to ensure that academic staff have freedom within the law to question and test received wisdom and to put forward new ideas and controversial or unpopular opinions without placing themselves in jeopardy of losing their jobs or privileges that they may have at their institutions. By virtue of the Higher Education and Research Act 2017, universities must comply with the public interest governance principles, including, amongst other things, in respect of academic freedom and freedom of speech. And most recently, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act 2023 amends the 2017 Act and enhances obligations for freedom of speech and academic freedom. Most of that Act has yet to be brought into force, but key features include new duties on the OFS and universities to promote free speech, within the law and academic freedom, new OFS conditions of registration for universities relating to free speech and academic freedom, an extension of the OFS's regulation on free speech matters to students' unions, OFS powers to monitor overseas funding received by universities and students' unions with a view to assessing the extent to which that funding may present a risk to free speech and academic freedom, a new complaint scheme operated by the OFS to consider free speech complaints about universities or students' unions, of course, a new role of Director of Freedom of Speech and Academic Freedom in the OFS, and also the introduction of a statutory tort for breach of the free speech duty that will permit individuals to seek legal redress for any loss that they've suffered because of a breach of the free speech duty. So if I think now about restrictions to free speech, there is, particularly hate speech and harassment, there is no consistent legal definition of hate speech. Section 5 of the Public Order Act 1986 provides that a person is guilty of an offence if he uses threatening or abusive words or behaviour, or disorderly behaviour, or displays any writing, sign or other visible representation which is threatening or abusive within the hearing or sight of a person likely to be caused harassment, alarm or distress thereby, unquote. Similar offences are created by that Act in relation to acts intended to or likely to stir up hatred on the grounds of race and also on the grounds of religion or sexual orientation, although for those there are defences designed to protect freedom of expression. And with regards to harassment, the Protection from Harassment Act 1997 prohibits a course of conduct that is likely to alarm or cause distress, and whilst harassment is not further defined, the courts have made it clear that an example would be racial abuse. And separately, the Equality Act itself defines and prohibits 3 types of harassment related to a protected characteristic, sexual harassment, and also less favourable treatment as a result of harassment. Importantly, context is relevant, so that universities and others have to make decisions based not only on the available facts, but also the specific context on a case-by-case basis. Or to put it another way, there isn't a checklist that you can go through to decide whether something is hate speech or harassment. So, let's consider a couple of real-world examples. The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life by Richard J. Herrnstein and Charles Murray is a book published in 1994 which purported to establish a genetic connection between race and intelligence. Whilst they would certainly argue that their purpose was to advance knowledge and was not driven by bigotry, their analysis, intentionally or not, does appear to perpetuate racist tropes. In any event, it has been widely disputed by mainstream science. Although it would be dependent on context and the way in which they are manifested, propagating these views is unlikely to constitute harassment or hate speech, and as such may not be lawfully restricted. Let's go back to Ron DeSantis. In July of this year, the US state of Florida approved new standards for teaching African American history in schools, requiring teachers to tell students that there were upsides to being enslaved, and requiring instruction on how slaves developed skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. Ron DeSantis was stated as spearheading these changes to combat woke ideology. He was asked to explain the curriculum amendment relating to personal benefits and stated, quote, "They're probably going to show that some of the folks that eventually parlayed, being a blacksmith into doing things later in life," unquote. So, would this be unlawful in Britain? Again, context and manifestation are important. But slavery minimisation isn't specifically illegal. And absent other material considerations, it would also likely not constitute hate speech or harassment. For both of these examples, many people will say that this is as it should be, that such speech should not be prohibited. There are, however, certainly strong arguments, legally and otherwise, which support this view. Sorry, not however. There are certainly strong arguments, legally and otherwise, which support this view. But quite apart from the upset and indeed outrage that any such examples may cause, universities have other obligations which may themselves conflict with such speech. For example, in England, universities are charged with taking steps to address student underrepresentation and disadvantage through access and participation plans regulated by the OFS, many of which focus on the reduction and elimination of awarding gaps, including those relating to students of particular ethnic heritages. There is strong evidence that an inclusive culture and a sense of belonging has a material benefit in addressing this problem. However, speech purporting to argue for the inherent inequality of intelligence between people of different ethnicities, or even of the so-called benefits of slavery, will almost certainly conflict with this obligation. It also bears noting that academics typically have pastoral roles with important responsibilities for the well-being of their students. Promoting a positive relationship between staff and students is essential, and this could easily be undermined if, for example, the academic is open and robust about their political viewpoint on any number of issues, particularly where such a viewpoint is contentious, or as I would argue in the case of the above examples, tendentious and offensive. As it happens, contestation regarding what is and what isn't lawful free speech isn't confined to universities. It can also get the government in a muddle. In May 2021, in an interview on Radio 4's Today programme regarding what was then the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill, Michelle Donnellan, who was then the Minister of State for Higher and Further Education, was asked whether the infamous Holocaust denier David Ruebain would, quote, merit the defence of your bill, unquote. The minister stated that the bill will protect any speech which is lawful and confirmed that so long as the speech did not stray into hate crimes or racism, a speech by a Holocaust denier would be lawful. Further, she did not deny that Ruebain would be entitled to compensation in the event that he was invited to speak at a university but was prevented from doing so. She then stated that, quote, there is a difference between condoning and supporting something as opposed to standing up for free speech, unquote. However, I think within a matter of hours, a spokesperson for Number 10 stated, quote, Holocaust denial is not something that the government would ever accept, unquote. Gavin Williamson, Education Secretary at the time, also stated, we know that anti-Semitic activity and anti-Semitism are not to be tolerated. It is clear in the Equality Act passed in 2010, and we will never tolerate that, and this legislation will not allow Holocaust deniers to be able to spread their hate and misinformation on our campuses, unquote. Later in the month, Donnellan was asked about the topic again at the 2021 Guild HE conference. As quoted by the Times Higher Education, this time, she said, universities will not be placed in a position where they are asked to protect a Holocaust denier, unquote. The minister emphasised that universities had to balance taking reasonably practical steps to allow free speech with their existing responsibilities under the Prevent Duty and legislation such as the Equalities Act, and said that Holocaust denial was an extremist view that could lead to harassment. So which view is right, or which of Donnellan's views is right? Holocaust denial is not a specific offence in the UK, but taken at face value, one could argue that at least aspects of the definition of harassment or hate speech are met, particularly given the significance of the Holocaust in relation to Jews and others. Certainly there is precedent for that view in judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, but these often engage questions of whether criminal convictions should be upheld. In the UK, to establish hate speech, the Crown prosecution would have to establish that the denier intended to stir up racial hatred, or that the denial would likely stir up such hatred. Their words would also have to be threatening, abusive, or insulting. This threshold might not be met, as apparently intimated by Donnellan in her first opinion. In summary, neither we, nor it appears the government, can be sure that a Holocaust denier would be entitled to be prevented from speaking in a university, nor indeed that they might receive compensation otherwise if they did. Let's explore this issue through the work of philosophers and theorists, including John Stuart Mill and his harm principle. In a 2020 article, the philosopher Melina Constantine Bell argued that in the modern age, bigoted speech should be recognised as harmful as members of historically marginalised social groups suffer tangible, concrete harms both directly from exposure to bigoted speech and indirectly because of the hostile social environment, discrimination and oppression that results. Unquote. In fact, there's compelling evidence that discrimination and harassment have negative outcomes on the health and well-being of those who are subject to it. And we should note that Bell writes in the context of the US First Amendment rather than the British legal framework, but her argument for prohibition beyond those set out earlier apply here, and in my view carry some weight. She gives examples of sexist humour and racist language directly impacting the confidence of its subjects and indirectly instigating and reinforcing discrimination. Her argument is nuanced. Bigoted speech may be justifiably prohibited where it is harmful and fails to communicate a viewpoint for consideration or discussion. For example, suppose in a class a white man expresses the view that men are naturally better at maths or are better leaders, or the view that economic disadvantage faced by British Caribbean heritage people is really a consequence of laziness. These claims articulate bigoted stereotypes and are likely to offend many, and indeed contribute to poorer health outcomes. But depending on the context, they may or may not constitute unlawful harassment or hate speech in UK law. But as Mill articulated, prohibited them from being spoken does not permit the opportunity for their refutation or for people to amend their beliefs in response to arguments and evidence so that their expression should be protected. However, Bell argues that the purpose of bigoted insults is not to express a viewpoint or opinion, but to harm and or reinforce one's own dominant social status, and so does not contribute to debate or the search for truth and should not be protected. To my mind, it's a compelling argument, but it does raise the question of whether and how we can know the purpose of speech and who is to judge. Of course, some bigoted speech may constitute harassment or hate speech, but not all will. Meanwhile, in her article Cancelled, published in the London Review of Books on 29th June, Professor Amir Srinivasan, Chile Professor of Social and Political Theory at the University of Oxford, argued that academic freedom must allow Oxford University geography dons to deny a platform to a climate change denier. Further, she argued that to be labelled as a racist, bigot, transphobe, etc. doesn't mean that the speaker's rights to free speech have been threatened. It is just a reminder that speech can be harmful and that failure to understand this leads to people complaining of being cancelled. And insofar as that there is a problem, Srinivasan argued that more government is not useful as it emboldens authorities and bureaucracies as a means of enacting cultural change. In an also well-argued rejoinder, The Awkward Truth About Free Speech, published in the online journal Unheard, Professor Kathleen Stocks stated that the most pressing issue is whether conditions exist in universities that dissuade people from pursuing certain controversial topics out of fear alone, and that academic freedom is not just the freedom to hold conclusions that you like. Incidentally, I can't really do justice to either article here, and I would commend both of them to you. So, strength of arguments for free speech and academic freedom and remedies are themselves contested. Interestingly, support for prohibition of some speech comes from an unlikely source. The Cato Institute, a right-wing libertarian American think tank, argued in its website Libertarianism that free societies must be willing to accept the possibility that absolute free speech will come at an increasingly greater cost to the pursuit of truth. Assuming the goal is to gain more knowledge, more speech is not always better than less speech. Of course, few argue for absolute free speech, but their point remains nonetheless. Again, I stress, I do not argue that lawful free speech or academic freedom should be curtailed. Rather, that there are complexities here which do not easily lend themselves to rigid legal or regulatory solutions. Turning now to the public sector equality duty. In their above-mentioned insight brief, Freedom to Question, Challenge and Debate, published in December last year, The OFS references the PSED, which is a proactive obligation on public bodies to have due regard to the need to eliminate unlawful discrimination, harassment and victimisation, advance equality of opportunity and foster good relations. Then, in a blog published on 11 January this year, Chief Executive Susan Lapworth references that brief and with regards to the PSED emphasises that, quote, it is not a duty to achieve those things, unquote, and hence should not be a limiting factor to free speech obligations. It is possible to interpret this in several ways, but the emphasis that she gives at least the impression that so long as one thinks about eliminating unlawful activity, advancing equality and fostering good relations, one needn't actually do anything, even if one had thought of something to do. In my experience, the PSED has been instrumental in making effective progress towards EDI, including in driving progress to bring together communities in areas of conflict. Certainly, it does not override freedom of speech obligations, but taken at its face value, the OFS's apparent approach would render it meaningless. Specifically, it elides the point that public bodies can legally and reasonably choose to take action under the PSED and may be required to do so, notwithstanding the qualifying phrase of having due regard, providing they don't breach other obligations. Compliance is a legal obligation which can be enforced via action by the EHRC or legal proceedings. Specific duties in England require public bodies to prepare and publish one or more equality objectives that should achieve one or more of the aims set out under the PSED, and there are similar requirements in Wales and Scotland. And a public body would be hard-pressed to demonstrate compliance if it did not actually do anything to advance those objectives beyond thinking about them. As the EHRC guidance on the PSED states, it requires equality considerations to be reflected into the design of policies and the delivery of services, including internal policies, and for these issues to be kept under review. This analysis is also reflected in something called the judge over your shoulder, which is guidance for civil servants, which references the case of R. Bracking v. Secretary of State for Work and Pensions in 2013. In particular, quote, the duty to have due regard obliges a public body to consider relevant matters that may affect a decision, then decide what weight to accord to the equality considerations. The level of due regard considered sufficient in any particular context depends on the facts, unquote. In fact, in most instances, the PSED and free speech within the law are entirely complementary. And again, I do not suggest that the duty trumps free speech, but I do think that there is a more complex interplay which can be illustrated in the question of universities adopting EDI positions. As intimated, Professor Ahmed has written extensively on academic freedom and freedom of speech. In one article published by Politeia, Academic Corporatism, a more pervasive form of tyranny in 2022, which of course is prior to his recent appointment to the OFS, he criticised, quote, institutional non-neutrality, unquote. The article states, quote, freedom of speech includes the freedom to adopt and defend any position you like on the controversial moral and political questions of the day. Within universities, this is what you would expect from individual students and academics. It should not be for the institutions themselves to take a stance, but it is what they've been doing, unquote. He gives, as an example of such non-neutrality, compulsory training for students and or staff, such as unconscious bias training and race awareness training. Additionally, Professor Ahmed criticises what he views as highly selective use of official statements, which he views as actively campaigning for a political end, and he includes as examples statements relating to race equality. Then, in June 2022, Michelle Donnellan, who at that time was Further and Higher Education Minister, queried whether participation in the in the higher education sector's Race Equality Charter and Athena Swan was compatible with free speech and academic freedom principles. Certainly, as Professor Ahmed underscores, it is right to ensure that EDI and any initiatives do not conflict with other obligations, and I've certainly come across trite and poor training. But I disagree that such initiatives described are a priori wrong. nor do I think that they necessarily breach the legal framework. Indeed, position-taking may actually be required to give effect to and comply with the public sector equality duty. There is a strong rationale for institutional programmes such as Athena Swan, the Race Equality Charter, or indeed the government's Disability Confidence Scheme. In addition to the points set out regarding the PSED, they can have a role in preventing discrimination and harassment. Indeed, I note that the OFS itself, in its statement of expectations for preventing and addressing harassment and sexual misconduct affecting students in higher education, states that, quote, universities should implement adequate and effective staff and student training with the purpose of raising awareness of and preventing harassment and sexual misconduct, unquote, including bystander initiatives. And powers in the Equality Act to permit what are known as positive action initiatives effectively mandate the taking of a position, that being to address structural underrepresentation, which of course is not the same as addressing unlawful inequality. Of course, Professor Ahmed may argue that he was not referring to all EDI initiatives in his criticisms, but at least some of those that he cites are ones which, in my view, may be lawful and have a meritorious benefit for universities. I do agree that universities should not take positions on external matters which are out with the organisation of a university and its purposes, and particularly not those involving controversy and contestation. I'm especially mindful of the obligation of universities as charities to act in ways that further their charitable purposes, and that of course limits their scope for action. But otherwise, the fact of a university adopting a position on, say, the importance of diversity in its leadership does not of itself require any of its staff or students to restrict their speech, including if they disagree. Universities are and should be sites of contestation and difference of opinion, and academics and staff often disagree with their university. So where does all this get us? I've purposefully focused on problems and boundaries, and it is important to restate that, notwithstanding the complexities which are outlined, free speech is essential, and also that there remain occasional failings of public bodies in ensuring it. However, there are also complex fact and context-specific areas of contestation which do not easily lend themselves to resolutions through the application of legal or regulative frameworks. These touch on sociological, philosophical, political, and generational issues engaging power, feeling, and identity. Megaphone-delivered and/or legalistic approaches are not well suited to addressing nuanced issues. Even if it is possible to navigate through to a correct legal answer on what is and what is not lawful in very context-specific circumstances without engaging armies of lawyers, the world and life are messier. Moreover, the law is not always clear and does not always resolve real concerns. It can be evidently reductive. Dramatically changing regulatory environments affect relationships between staff and students and their institutions, and evolving demands and expectations of regulators, funders, and other stakeholders add further complexity. More generally, political agendas are not always transparent, and hot-button topics can be ideal vehicles to convey other motives. So while laws are necessary, they are not sufficient, and we must find other complementary approaches. As a start, universities must cultivate within their communities the skill of listening. As many of you will know, amongst a range of initiatives that we have initiated an open listening programme with the aim of creating and establishing listening spaces that offer new possibilities for dialogue whilst maintaining authentic relationships and resilience in the face of conflict and contestation, seeking to build individual and collective capacity of staff and students to engage with difficult conversations in alternative and constructive ways, and developing and maintaining supportive relationships across different life experiences and identities. I believe that initiatives such as this are required alongside information, understanding, community building, and a range of other tools. Engagement on campus will be just as important as the sector's dialogue with the OFS. Meanwhile, I was very interested to read King's College London's recent Policy Institute report, Freedom of Speech in UK Higher Education, part of which merits quoting. Quote, "First, we need to recognise the highly charged and polarised environment in which the new legislation will be operating. We cannot see the debate and actions in universities as disconnected from wider culture war narratives, where perceptions among university students are shaped by external coverage as well as direct experience. And a number of actors are incentivized to exaggerate or downplay the extent of the challenge. This should, for example, make us particularly cautious in how and when legal measures are employed, as fractious, high-profile court cases may themselves shape perceptions and encourage division rather than improve outcomes on free speech. It also points to the central importance of the role of free speech director, as this role will to a large degree determine whether this is an important, positive intervention in supporting free speech or another front in a culture war." Unquote. Ultimately, the aim is to welcome and embrace diversity, not only in the EDI sense of background, identity and belief, but also of thought, method and discipline. That is not easy or straightforward, but it is necessary and requires thoughtful understanding of complex relations. And in this regard, we all have obligations. Thank you.